On behalf of WPC's Adult Education Committee, I want to express our deepest gratitude for your presence at today's vital conversation titled "For the Love of All of Us, Why Interfaith Dialogue is Now More Important Than Ever." We are honored to have Dr. Reinhard Krauss with us, all the way from Germany, where he is currently serving as pastor of the American Church in Berlin. Dr. Krauss is a distinguished scholar and lecturer at esteemed institutions such as UCLA and the New Theological Seminary of the West. Dr. Krauss, with his profound academic background, including a theology degree from the University of Tübingen and a PhD in religious studies from the University of St. Andrews, leads the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies as its executive director. His commitment to fostering bridges of understanding, mutual respect, and cooperation among Jews, Christians, and Muslims is not just commendable, but essential in our world today. In light of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a topic that touches the hearts and minds of many around the globe and in our very neighborhood, Dr. Krauss's insights into interfaith dialogue are particularly pertinent. His experience and wisdom offer us a beacon of hope as we navigate the complexities of coexistence with our diverse neighbors and our Christian commitment to peace building. As we gather for today's faith conversation, let us listen deeply, converse respectfully, and reflect richly on the power of dialogue and the importance of coming together across faith traditions to seek common ground and understanding. It is through these efforts that we can aspire to a future where diversity is celebrated and conflict gives way to reconciliation. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Reinhard Krauss as we embark on this journey of discovery and understanding for the love of all of us. Thank you.
It is absolutely wonderful to be with you, and I have prepared a little PowerPoint presentation. Let me see whether I can manage to do that. Wonderful. Okay. Technology works. I am absolutely delighted to be with you again, this time only virtually. I wish I could be there in person. Last time we talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I cannot see your facial expressions as much as I would like to. And I would like to thank Jake for the invitation and introduction, and it's really a delight to be with you across the ocean. I would like to add and emphasize again, as I serve as the executive director of the Academy for Judaic, Christian, and Islamic Studies, the Academy is dedicated to building bridges of understanding, mutual respect, and cooperation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. As you hear from my accent, I am also German. This makes the topic, the sensitive topic that we are talking about today, especially difficult. As you know, and as I have talked with Jake, the issue is on everybody's heart and mind, and it is especially close to you due to the proximity of UCLA with the unrest and the turmoil. We are bombarded every day on the news with news of the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and we live in a very turbulent time, and our hearts and minds are both grieving. We feel passion, we feel anger, all of those together. So it's a sensitive topic, and we need to name that elephant in the room. What I, in thinking about today, what I'm not intending to focus on is the history of the conflict. That has taken books and libraries to lay out, and I will give you a suggestion later on in the brief presentation about what would be a good short synopsis of delving into the historical origins of the conflict that is very balanced. I also do not intend to focus on geopolitics. Geopolitics has gotten us to a point where we have divided into factions and tribes, us versus you, us versus them. And this, I believe, is not the purpose of today's presentation and your interest. So I've named my presentation Finding the Right Words. How can people of faith talk about the current conflict in Israel-Palestine? Also, I would like to add, like I've always said to my students in any course I've taught, I'm not here to tell you what to think, but to give you something to think about. And hopefully, by the end of my brief reflections, we will all have something to think about. So I want to focus on finding the right words, and especially how can people of faith talk about the conflict, because we are all people of faith. We are Christians. I don't know whether you have any Muslim or Jewish visitors today, participants. It would be wonderful if we had. I also, in the lead up to my presentation, had a conversation with Jake, and I said, we need to be very careful. And I'm very conscious to that our in-house conversation is the same as the conversation we have with people on the outside, that we should speak the same language and keep our integrity by always assuming there can be a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist in our midst who would not be offended by what we say. And that maybe is already one suggestion for how we can talk about the current conflict. I want to just briefly talk about the foundations for us as Christians, and that is Jesus is the foundation from which everything stems. This is the case for Christians. It's not the case necessarily for all people of faith wanting to talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I would like to also mention scripture, which is important, that we are grounded in scripture before we begin to speak, that we pray about the issue, that we inform ourselves sufficiently. There is so much talk without sufficient information, and I want to come back to that in a little while. And I want to start with the scriptural foundation and Paul's letter to the congregation in Ephesus. The situation is Paul is in prison, and he provides some pastoral guidance to the congregation in Ephesus. And he writes, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, in the Lord, beg you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There's one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. He himself granted that some are apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ, We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. Paul says, I am a prisoner in the Lord, and I beg you. Paul makes this appeal to the congregation in Corinth as an urgent appeal. And he says to the congregation, when you are in conversation with one another, when you're in community, be so with all humility and gentleness. Be patient with one another, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So, according to Paul, from prison, he says unity and peace are the goal of our conversation. It is not divisiveness. It is not winning an argument. It is being patient with one another. It is not judging the other and disqualifying the other from communication or from the argument. And he argues this, and when we look at our current situation, what Paul is saying here is currently countercultural, because we are arguing, our society has fractured into numerous arguments, positions, tribes, divisiveness. Paul says the goal is the unity in the Spirit and to be gentle and show humility with one another. So Christians and all people of faith, according to Paul at least, are called to march to a different drum, as a very different drum than what we are hearing in our society and which surrounds us with the cacophony. And then Paul says, we must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. I couldn't find a better description of our current situation. We live in a world of fake news, post-factual world, a world of deceit, scheming, manipulation, and propaganda. And Paul says to us, grow up, become mature, discern. Do not be blown about, as he says, to and fro by every doctrine of people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. And lastly, he says, speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. So the goal, the measure for Christians is Jesus. And what is it that Jesus says when we are called to speak the truth in love? Jesus says that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Who is the neighbor? When Jesus was asked, he tells the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And Paul later says in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So who is the neighbor? For Christians at least, the neighbor is everyone, without exception. Additionally, when we look at Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus was a pacifist. For example, in Luke 6, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. What does this all mean practically? I would like to briefly talk about several points that I believe we should and could take from this biblical foundation. One is to be aware and to speak from your own context. We each have our vantage point and perspective. By that, I don't mean that all perspectives are relative. I don't mean to say every perspective and every opinion is equally valid. But to simply illustrate this or flesh it out a little, I am a German Christian. I am a person, a human being, who was born into a nation who perpetrated the Holocaust. I have also become aware during my studies that Christianity has been deeply, deeply implicated in the persecution of the Jews and anti-Semitism. That is something that I need to acknowledge and be aware of when I speak with people of other faith. Sometimes I say I have no right with that background to lecture other people on morality. At the same time, I was born after the Holocaust, so I have wrestled with this all my life and have come to the conclusion that I am not guilty of what happened 80 years ago, but I'm in a special way responsible to learn the lessons that are to be learned from that horrific event and to do my level best to seek to prevent from anything like this ever happening again. This, in fact, is one of the main motivators behind the work, the interfaith work that I do and feel actually called to. It's way more than a job. It's really a calling, as I understand myself. So let us be aware, each of us, and speak from our own context, from our own biography, from our own perspective, rather than to make generalizing statements when we are in conversation with one another, and especially when we are in conversation with people of other faith. So this requires, I believe, both an intellectual and a spiritual and personal humility to say we do not know it all. None of us is fully informed about any issue. None of us is fully informed about the Israel-Palestine conflict. None of us is a scholar who knows everything. None of us knows the ways of God. None of us knows God's ways in the world. And also, just from a personal perspective, Jesus again and Paul call us to personal humility. Then the second point I would outline and suggest is to ask genuine questions. Sometimes we ask questions when we are in conversation with other people that we already think we know the answer, and we only ask a question to perhaps trap somebody into an argument. I find it most helpful to ask genuine questions of other people. So, for example, when I ask, just to give you an example, I went to the market recently, and it was during the holy month of Ramadan for Muslims, and they had a food stand. And I said, "You are Muslims, right?" And I said, are you fasting? And they said, yes, the service. And I said, this is incredible that you are preparing food for other people and you observe the fast during Ramadan. So this to me is a genuine question of curiosity. When I ask somebody, are you Muslim? And they say yes or say no, I say, well, what kind of Muslim are you? Or when I ask somebody, are you Jewish? Because they may be wearing a kippah, I don't assume I know who that person is. I want to ask genuine questions saying, what kind of Jew are you? And perhaps explore a little deeper what their own biographical, ethnic, or spiritual journey has been. And I find we get into most interesting and constructive conversations rather than assuming that when I ask a question, I already know the answer. So then the other stance I would recommend to all of us is to be open to learn, including and especially from those with whom you disagree. That is a very challenging and difficult thing to do at times when you disagree with somebody, that they can tell you something, whether it is a fact or an opinion or an argument, that is genuinely persuasive and plausible, and to be open in both your heart and your mind to learn from others, rather than assuming we already know what the answer is. This is not our traditional way of debating. Debating is winning arguments, but speaking the truth in love, I believe, requires a stance that is open to learn, and to be open to learn, especially from those with whom we disagree. Neuroscience has told us, and psychology, that we have a confirmation bias. We want to hear and respond much stronger to opinions that already confirm what we think we know. But when that happens, and it happens at the moment very strongly in our society, we separate ourselves into respective echo chambers. We only hear what we already know. And that leads to the continuing fracturing and divisiveness in our society. So an openness of heart and mind, in line with what Paul says in the text we looked at, the humility to think and to acknowledge that we do not know everything. And then I would also urge that we inform ourselves with discernment from a broad range of diverse news sources. Sometimes, and people have said, it's so difficult, what is there to believe? Paul says, grow up, don't be children anymore, discern, and look at a variety of perspectives. In 1 Thessalonians, it says, test everything, keep what is good, and stay away from everything that is evil. I think that is a very helpful approach as we look at news sources. I don't know what news sources you are reading. I would strongly encourage you to read news sources from both sides of the political spectrum. Some of it you may find hard to stomach from the other side, whatever side you are on. I would encourage you to read the Israeli newspapers. I would also encourage you to read Palestinian news sources. And not to say you have to take sides immediately, that what you read is factual, is what you have to assent to, but only by being exposed to a variety of perspectives is it possible to make up your own mind. For example, on the internet, you can find the charter of the Likud party, the main party of the current coalition government in Israel. You can also find the text of the charter of Hamas. So maybe you want to look into this and actually read for yourself what these documents say that are so hotly debated in the news every day. And there are also, I would encourage you to look at reliable sources about the history of the conflict. There are so many biased sources, and I would just like to recommend one. And it's a short book. It's called The Israeli-Palestine Conflict, the Palestinian-Israel Conflict, by Martin Bunton. Unfortunately, it was already published in 2013. So that's 10 years old, and a lot has happened since. But it's an excellent resource to understand the historical roots of the conflict, which sometimes get lost in the shuffle, and there are many biased from either side, biased depiction and historical accounts of the news. This is a very good and very short introduction that I have used in my courses that is very helpful. Another rule or suggestion is to not judge others by association. None of us likes to be labeled. Sometimes I say, when people ask me, are you Christian? I say yes, but don't assume you know what that means. And likewise, like some of us don't want to be lumped together with members of our own tribe, other Christians. Nobody likes to be lumped in with other people with whom they disagree. So it goes back to asking genuine question of other people. Who are you? Not that I know when you say you are Jewish, that I assume I know who you are. I don't. But to simply ask questions. What are your views? What are your opinions? Or the same of a Muslim or an atheist. What do you mean? You say you are an atheist. What does that mean to you? I remember a student at UCLA at one point said, I have thought about this for years and years and have come to the conclusion that atheism is really the truth. And, I was a little puzzled that somebody in his early 20s had studied this for years and years and years. But so be it. And I said, welcome to the class. You are the one to ask the difficult questions that sometimes maybe people of faith have a little hesitancy asking. At the end of the course, when I asked, what have you learned? Several people voiced their views, and this student said, this is very interesting. This is the first time I've been together with people who are religious and also intelligent. And so there was great laughter in the class, but he had learned something. And so I would encourage all of us to not judge others by association, not to put labels on people as if we assumed we know. Sometimes I have even wondered whether it makes sense to call religions religion. The great scholar Wilfred Cantwell Smith has wondered and said religion is really a modern term that occurred in modernity, and before that people had convictions, had beliefs, but they were not necessarily lumped together as religion. So let us not judge others by association, because this is also, I would say, an evil that is currently afoot in our society, that if somebody is even talking with somebody, they are all of a sudden in the same camp and labeled and sometimes smeared. And so let us not give in to tribalism and do the countercultural thing. And then the question is, let us measure by the same ethical standards. This is not what the news does. The news has very different standards, for example, when it comes to Israel or Palestine, depends on where you are on the spectrum. The same is true of the conflict in Ukraine. Sometimes the International Court of Justice is applauded, and in other cases it's decried. But the even perhaps more important question that I want to raise, and I want to raise in this context for this suggestion to measure with the same ethical standard, the question, are you a pacifist like Jesus? In our current world, that is something that many would say, no, I'm not. And how to square that with being a follower of Jesus is, I think, a question we need to wrestle with. If you're not a pacifist like Jesus, but you consider yourself a Christian, do you believe violence is ever legitimate? Is it legitimate in self-defense? And if it's legitimate in self-defense, by whom? By whom is self-defense legitimate? And is violence ever legitimate to achieve political goals? It's a question I want to raise, not that I have the answer. As I said at the beginning, I want to give you something to think about, not to tell you what to think. And then the question are there limits to violence? Is there proportionality to violence? And two more questions, are international human rights and the Geneva Convention applicable for everyone? And is international law binding for everyone? And I think it's important that when we think about these issues, we consciously attempt, at least, to measure with the same yardstick, to measure with the same ethical standards. After having said all this, I think what, as Christians, we are also called to do is to have the courage to hold on to our deepest convictions, even and perhaps especially like currently when they're not popular. The question again is, are we committed to be followers of Jesus and be pacifists and say all violence is wrong as Christians? Another, I think, uncontestable value that Christians need to hold is the absolute sanctity of every human life. This is something that is the core of the Jewish teachings. It's the core of the Christian teachings, the teachings of Jesus. And it is not least what I take away from the history of the Holocaust, that every human life is sacred and there can be no distinction or exception. The question is, what are we called to do if that is the case? And as we explored at the beginning of my brief reflections, the question really is, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? It sounds like maybe a flimsy slogan, but if we are to grow into Christ, who is the head of the church, the head of the community, the head of humanity, then the question becomes, what would Jesus do? And Would Jesus join a demonstration, perhaps? Would Jesus join a vigil, perhaps? Would Jesus write a letter to the editor of a newspaper, perhaps? I assume if he came today, he would be literate. Would he perhaps join an interfaith conversation group? Those are questions that don't lend themselves to easy answers. It requires for each of us in our particular situation and context and circumstance to say, what does it mean to love God and love my neighbor as myself in the way Jesus exemplified it for all of us? Jesus, before his death, said, I'm going to be going back to God, and I will no longer be with you, but you will do greater things than I do. That is mind-boggling. So he says, you all need to be Jesuses. So the question is, talking and speaking the truth in love, he is again the example of not flinching away from speaking the truth, but doing so in love and renouncing all retaliation and violence. So that means have the courage to hold on to your deepest beliefs, especially when your view is not currently popular. And it requires both. It requires the humility to know that you do not possess the truth, and the courage to trust that the truth will eventually win the day. Martin Luther King, as we all know, put it beautifully, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So both humility and courage are required or called for us as followers of Jesus. And both the humility and the courage that are required for speaking the truth in love, for me, are most beautifully embodied in a man by the name of Oscar Romero. I'm sure most of you have heard of him. He was the Archbishop of San Salvador, and he spoke out against poverty, social injustice, assassinations, and torture amid a growing war between the left and the right-wing forces in his country. And on March 24th, 1980, Bishop Romero was assassinated while he was celebrating Mass for the stance he took. And I would like to share a poem that he wrote shortly before he died as a conclusion. It helps now and then to step back and take the long view. God's reign is not only beyond our efforts, it is beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is another way of saying God's reign always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives include everything. But this is what we are about. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold a future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for God's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future that is not our own. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Krauss. We have some time now to open it up for questions. And I'd ask that you just raise your hand and we'll call on you as much as we can. We have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. So we should have a good time. So if you wrote one down, that would be the time to, to fire away. But whoever would like to lead us off, please do ask your question. Celia, I see you smiling. Do you have a question? You don't have one today? Okay. Okay.
I'll be bold.
Go ahead, Paula. Thank
Dr.
you.
Krauss, Paula Mann here. You mentioned talking and listening to the other person. For me, the challenge, whether it's this conversation or any, is when someone seems so stuck in their position.
Yes.
Not that I would be stuck in my position, of course. Is how to, I guess, instead of keeping the wall building up, to get a bridge across between two of you, when it seems that one or the other is just I am absolutely right. This is what the Bible says, or this is what the book says. This is what's happening. Can you give encouragement and coaching advice on how to break that wall down?
Yeah, I again find it again and again most helpful to ask questions. For example, the question of how did you arrive at your position? That sometimes goes beyond it. It provides a little crack in the wall to say, have you had experiences, personal experiences that have led you to this position? Help me understand how you arrived at this position. It sometimes gets through the generalities and through the posture, oh, as everybody knows, this is my opinion. And I had, again, a student in the course, he says, as everybody knows. And I said, well, let's just have a little poll here. Everybody raised their hand who knows this. And it was a far out position. And it says, well, it's quite clear that not everybody knows what you are saying everybody knows. So please help us explain how you arrived at your position. What sources are you reading? What are your news sources? What is your personal experience? So we can all understand what everybody knows. So a little humor helps at times. Some questions help at times. But it helps to not denigrate the other person as being in another camp. Does that make sense? I'm
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
I saw Celine's hand behind you, Mike, and then to you, Mike. Okay.
So I think as a Christian.
Celine, I'm so sorry. Would you stand up and speak toward the microphone here?
Where's the microphone?
Oh, right here in the middle.
So one of the things, throughout my life, and one of the most important things I've experienced and sort of withheld, is that I don't have a need to explain myself, especially when there's judgment pursuing. So for me, because I tackle life and I don't exactly always have like a linear pathway. There's a lot of people that, judge. Like, for example, one thing I'm considering is actually joining the Space Force for the U.S. military. And a lot of people, they sort of look at me like, it's not like you don't have any other options. Why are you considering violence? You'll be in charge of killing people. You'll be killed, perhaps, even if you become a first lieutenant, then you become these things. But for me, I don't always need to respond to these judgments, because I have a sort of faith in myself that God has a plan. There's always a reason. I'll need to learn Chinese and Russian to become an astronaut, but also these people are very like you don't belong here, and they're very against it. And so it comes into me when I'm thinking about the violence. Like I was on campus the other day and these two girls were shouting like, you should be ashamed of this. How can you sleep at night? And I sit down and, you know, I do my music, I do my engineering stuff. And I think like, I can't do everything, even if my goal in life is to be the 18th century Renaissance man, whatever I joke with that. But you can't, I like what you said about like, you can do something and it enables you. And so even when I feel like hopeless and I don't know, and I start to judge myself because everyone has these judgments, I'm wondering, like, is it like the question is that, like, who are you to know what God's plan is for me? And just because, you know, I don't have a secure job at JPL or I got into this program that you did, like, why are you judging me for my circumstances? And I just don't really know how to cope with all of this judgment that goes on around me.
I'm not clear. What is it, a question or is it a comment?
How do you handle the judgment from around you? People tend to project themselves, I think.
Yes.
Especially me as a young person with a life ahead of her, like, or I haven't done anything, you know, and then people kind of, they project like, are you on my side?
Right. What you just said sounds absolutely wonderful. This you have internalized what Jesus actually said. Everybody belongs into the circle. I don't need to justify myself for being part of the circle. So to me, what you're saying is a very Christian stance to say, yes, I belong. I'm someone. I'm a child of God in theological language. And my self-worth does not depend on the judgment or the affirmation of others. God has said yes to me in the most profound and ultimate way. So congratulations. Some of us are wrestling with that still. But I find what you just said to be absolutely beautiful.
Well, I guess like my question is, sorry, it's I have doubts now because especially with violence, because with becoming a warrior, I don't know, my ambitions may be great and I'm not sure. I mean, they might have a point. The people I'm talking to aren't Christian. They're like devoutly not Christian. And it's funny because I'd say I would fight for peace, but that itself is an oxymoron, right? I'm doing it for my own character. So I wanted to know what.
If you stop asking yourself whether you are on the right way, I think you have lost your way. All of us need to always ask ourselves continuously not to be on autopilot, but to say, what does God want of me? I remember a colleague from South Africa. He came to visit, and he went to visit Karl Barth, one of the great scholars of his time in the 20th century. And Karl Barth asked him the question, are you free to preach the gospel? And he said, yes, of course I'm free to preach the gospel in my congregation. And he said that question never left him because it was a white congregation in South Africa. And eventually he resigned and took a job during apartheid still in a black township as a white pastor, and he resigned his job. So sometimes God continues to speak. We are not finished yet. And so, but your self-confidence of not needing to be judged or not depending on the judgment of others is really wonderful. But I also hope that you keep asking the questions that cause you some doubt. And yeah.
Thank you.
Mike.
Well, thank you, by the way, Dr. Krauss. It's been very illuminating. The quote from Ephesians seems to contain a kind of a contradiction, because in the beginning, it almost seems naive to have the goals that are in the early part the verse, right? And then you get to the part about not being like a child. And there's an inherent tension, right? Because on the one hand, you must be humble and accept, not accept the views of others, but be open to the views of others, which carries a kind of a naivete about it. And then we're also encouraged not to be like children, so to, as you pointed out, to try and find the truth and judge the truth and assess the truth. And I guess, as you say, we are so much in a time now where finding truth seems almost impossible. There's so much fiction in our news and in our society. I guess the key really is humility. But that's a tough balance to strike.
It's a very tough balance. Thank you for that question, or it's more a comment. I would simply say that tension in Ephesians that you point out, to say we are called to be humble and seeking peace. And at the same time, we need to inform ourselves, we need to discern, we need to test everything and keep whatever is good and stay away from evil. I think, to me, leads to a posture that we passionately speak in favor of our deepest convictions, at the same time knowing we could be ultimately wrong in God's eyes. That to me seems to be that tension. We are not to be squeamish and we are not to be wallflowers, but we need to speak for what we believe is true. And in God's eyes, we could be wrong. And if we forget that second part, that we are only human, I think it leads to hubris and a false pride and that judgmentalism that is so, shall we say, obnoxious when we encounter it in others. It's hard to see in ourselves.
It's a matter of goals, right? So where the Israelis and the Palestinians find themselves now is with two conflicting goals, right? The Palestinians want the land and the Israelis want the land.
Yes.
And the people will tailor their truth to the goal that they're pursuing. And if we as Christians, our goal is to honor the sanctity of each human life, then that has to be our ultimate goal as Christians, is peace. And so our truth really must serve the goal of peace, I think.
Yes. Yes, I would fully agree that we can only speak from our perspective, from our faith tradition. And this is why I also said Jews and Muslims may not necessarily embrace the teachings of Jesus, for example, of nonviolence. And we do not need to be judgmental about them or say they are less. So Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Which neighbor? All neighbors. So it means we need to love Jews as ourselves. We need to love Muslims as ourselves. We need to love atheists ourselves. Otherwise, we are not Christians. What other people believe is or hold fast to is really, in some sense, not for us to judge. But what we are called is to accept everybody as a child of God, that whose life and dignity is untouchable, inviolable.
Emily, you'll know Emily, actually, Dr. Krauss.
I do.
Hi, Dr. Krauss. I wanted to thank you for speaking here today. This was really lovely. A lot to think about, as you say, leave us with things to think about, not necessarily tell us what to think. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is how, with the things happening in Gaza and in Israel, it's very easy to feel hopeless.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if sort of from your experience, if you could share maybe a brief story or interaction that gave you hope surrounding this issue.
I mean, this circle gives me hope. And it's an experience that you had in person, Emily. Namely, we recently had a gathering from the academy where Jews, Christians, and Muslims came together under the motto that Jake mentioned, for the love of all of us, why interfaith relations are now more important than ever. But as you know, Emily, because you were on the planning team, it was very difficult for people to trust to come into this shared space without wondering, what is the agenda? Am I being safe from people? Am I being judged? Am I being attacked for my views? And what happened actually was that people came away and say, we need to have more of this, the human connection, because our opinions, our news, what we read in our respective echo chambers is driving us away from one another. So as an example is simply also this group of people, we are connected only virtually, but I sense the connection that everybody is embracing, that the human connection is absolutely essential. And that is also my only hope, if there is any hope for Israel and Gaza. I don't, after every conflict, a time has come when people needed to sit together and make peace. In Europe, where I grew up, it was unthinkable that Germans and the French would ever make peace after millions of people being slaughtered. Now, people go from Germany and have a shopping trip or have a nice lunch in France. It was unthinkable. So my hope is that the time will come when people will really recognize, or perhaps re-recognize, each other's humanity. But I also believe that each of us needs to sow those seeds of compassion and love, and being non-judgmental and humble, because this is what Jesus is telling us to say. We can only sow seeds. The conflict seems so immense. The prospect seems so hopeless. But Jesus also promised us that we are going with the grain of the universe if we follow in his footsteps.
Well, Dr. Krauss, I just, on behalf of Westwood Presbyterian Church, I just want to thank you again so much for your time with us and your sharing your wisdom and your insight. And of course, we pray flourishing for your ministry in Berlin and for the continued work of the Academy. Again, just on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a true pleasure.